Welcome, welcome. It's so wonderful to see you, or not see you, but to see your names coming in. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to day one of our Tell It Slant Poetry Festival. This is our week-long virtual program, which is celebrating the revolutionary poetic voice of Emily Dickinson and her impact on contemporary creativity and culture. I hope you have had the chance to check out our full calendar of events and sign up for lots of sessions. This is, again, day one, so we have much more coming up. We started off the morning with the first of 7 sessions of the Emily Dickinson Marathon, a circle reading of all 1,789 Dickinson poems. So we are off and running, and we're really excited to be able to bring you the festival, which is now in its 8th year, into a virtual format and into your homes this week. And we hope that you and yours are well. I hope you've been able to look forward to this afternoon's program as much as I have. Our guest, Mike Kelly, is going to give us a tour of highlights of the Dickinson collection held at Frost Library in Amherst, Massachusetts. And then we'll have a good amount of time at the end for you to ask Mike your questions about the collection and his work. So as Mike is talking to us, and he's got about 45 minutes of material to share before we take your questions. But during that time, if you are in the webinar with us, you can feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box while he's presenting and after. And if you look down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see things like mute and stop video. And you'll also see a little box that says Q&A with 2 little dialog boxes. So that's where you can enter those questions. For those of you following along on Facebook, because we are live this afternoon, you can absolutely post your questions there and we will do our best to address those too. This program will conclude right around 1:15 Eastern Standard Time today. So I am delighted now to introduce our guest, Mike Kelly. He is the head of Archives and Special Collections at Amherst College, where he oversees the school's collection of more than 80,000 rare books, along with a host of archival and manuscript collections. He has worked in special collections for over 20 years. He spent 11 years as the curator of books at the Fales Library and Special Collections at New York University before coming to Amherst in 2009. He received his master's in library science from the University of Texas, and he also holds a master's in English from the University of Virginia. He was elected to membership in the American Antiquarian Society in 2016, and that same year he was awarded the Reese Fellowship for American Bibliography and the History of the Book in the Americas by the Bibliographical Society of America for his work on the bibliography of Samson Occum, a member of the Mohegan Tribe of Connecticut. He also co-curated with Carolyn Vega the exhibition I'm Nobody, Who Are You? The Life and Poetry of Emily Dickinson at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York, which ran from January through May in 2017. And I don't know if any of our viewers had the chance to see that exhibition. It was a real treasure. And the first time that many of these objects that were in that exhibit had been together in the same room since perhaps Emily Dickinson's lifetime. So really just a wonderful treat of an exhibit. And we're going to hear more about that work today. Mike, thank you so much for being with us.
Absolutely. You know I love talking about Emily Dickinson. It's true. And shall I just share my screen and dive right in?
You may.
All right. This is definitely a different format than usual. Although the advantage is, what do we have? We're up to 107 participants now. We can't fit 107 people in the reading room at one time. So we're adapting and making the best out of our situation. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm so glad that you are here. And I have, what I'm going to do today, I've got sort of 2 parts to what I'm going to present. And so first I have some slides that I want to show of various highlights. But then for the second part of my talk, I want to show you the wonders of Amherst College digital collections, which has become a real lifeline for us in this pandemic and working remotely. And so I want to show you how you can dig into Dickinson's manuscripts yourselves, no matter where you are. If you have an internet connection, you will be able to see just about everything I'm showing you today. So Emily Dickinson, Amherst College, Amherst, Massachusetts, a very long history. And starting, of course, with the image, the iconic image of the poet, the only known authenticated image of Emily Dickinson. And this is how it actually looks. This is a completely unretouched image. Normally folks clean up all those scratches when they're going to put Emily Dickinson on a poster, but I really love showing the original as is in its original case with little bits of it missing. But this is the daguerreotype portrait. And I want to back up and start with the tight relationship between the Dickinson family and Amherst College. And so the image of the campus, this is Amherst College in 1821, as painted by Ora White Hitchcock, the wife of Amherst College's third president, Edward Hitchcock, someone that Dickinson almost certainly knew personally. The building on the right is the first building the college ever constructed, South College. The cornerstone was laid for that 200 years ago last month. And on the left is the first church in Amherst, which was later torn down and is now part of the Amherst College campus. But the college grew out of, it was a bunch of people interested in education in Western Mass and expanding access to education. So the college was founded to provide for indigent young men of hopeful piety to become trained up in the Christian ministry. And Samuel Fowler Dickinson, Emily Dickinson's grandfather, was one of the founders of Amherst College. He did a lot of fundraising. The document that you see on the right is a letter that is signed by Samuel Fowler Dickinson and Zephaniah Swift Moore, so the first president of the college. So Dickinson was involved in founding the college, which grew out of Amherst Academy, which already the whole Dickinson family was involved in Amherst Academy as well. So on the left, you see there is a photograph of, and it's the building on the left in that portrait that was Amherst Academy, a co-educational institution. The New England Academy was a whole movement. And so this was co-educational. It was slightly better than the one-room schoolhouse sort of education. This was very much a concern of the Congregationalists. Most of the founders of Amherst College come out of the Congregationalist church, and just a full embrace of education as a key to that mission. And on the right side of the screen at the bottom, you can see, here are the people who were in the English department of Amherst Academy. This is the 1846-47 academic year. And at the top is the list of males, and at the bottom is the beginning of the list of females. And at the very bottom of that list, you see Emily E. Dickinson. And what I always find fascinating when you start looking into some of these documents around Dickinson's life is looking just at who she would have been at school with. Like this list on the screen right now gives us a whole lot of information about the people Dickinson encountered in her everyday life. The student from Berlin, that would be Berlin, Massachusetts, and not somebody who was from Germany in Emily Dickinson's class. But she did have a classmate from Brooklyn on Long Island, which is interesting. And so looking into Amherst Academy and the Amherst Academy catalogs that we have can really give you that context and really name names, like who was in Dickinson's world? Well, this is the list right here. These are some people she definitely would have had contact with on a regular basis in and around the building pictured on the left. Move forward slide. There we go. All right. Okay. Good thing. Sorry. Okay, there we go. Another connection between Amherst Academy and the college is that many of the students of Amherst College would teach at the academy. And so on the left, we have one of the images of the poet that we have is this silhouette. And this is a silhouette, as it says, somebody helpfully wrote right on it, executed by Charles Temple, a native of Smyrna in 1845, and that is Emily E. Dickinson. Now, Charles Temple, if you look at the Amherst College catalog on the right, you see his name there towards the bottom of that list, Charles Temple. They give his hometown as Valletta, Malta. And when he was at Amherst College, he was living in 24 South College. That was his dorm room. Because Amherst was founded to train indigent young men of hopeful piety for the Christian ministry, we attracted a lot of children who were born of American missionaries living abroad. So Charles Temple's family were Christian missionaries in and around the Mediterranean. We have him both in Malta and at Smyrna. And they sent their son back to the United States to get a proper Congregationalist education toward himself becoming a missionary. And he was the French instructor at Amherst Academy. And so that's how he would have encountered Emily Dickinson, who would have been 14, possibly 15 years old when this silhouette was cut. And just thinking again about how these documents really help expose this social life that Dickinson had. So what better way, like sitting with her French instructor as he cuts her silhouette. That is a little vignette. I don't know if they use that in the Dickinson show on the Apple Plus. Is that, I don't know if that, I've only watched 1 or 2 episodes of that. But these reminders that these were, young people just sitting and talking. The other bit that I love about the silhouette is that it is a, analog technology of memory, right? That you don't, before photography, and even though photography exists in 1845, it is not widespread. If you wanted to remember a loved one of your options was, well, I need a pair of scissors and a piece of paper, and I can sit down and cut the silhouette of this person that I want to remember, that I want to just have an excuse to sit and chat with for however long it takes to cut the silhouette. The other technology of memory from the time, I'm trying to advance my slides without going too far forward. Nope, there we go. This is Dickinson's lock of hair. So again, this is a technology of memory that only requires a pair of scissors, that this was a common practice to mail hair to friends. And so the story of this particular lock of hair is that Dickinson sent it to her friend, Emily Fowler Ford, in 1853. And if you have your volume of Johnson's letters of Emily Dickinson, letter 99 is all about, I told you that when the next time the barber came, I would save a ringlet for you, and keeping my promise, here it is. It's a paraphrase. Dickinson says it better. And in 1983, William Bailey, the great-grandson of Emily Fowler Ford, found the lock of hair and sent it to Amherst College. And so we know the chain of ownership, and this is, as far as we know, the only authentic lock of Dickinson's hair. The questions people usually ask, have we done any kind of testing on it? We have not, nor have we attempted to clone Emily Dickinson. That is, the 4th graders usually ask that question. We have not done either of those things. No one has tested it to see, we don't, well, first of all, no one has actually proposed doing that for us in a serious way. We don't know what the costs would be. And also, we're always loath to expose our materials to any kind of process that could potentially be destructive or expose them to risk. And so that's the hair. It was pretty red. And one of the great things about having that exhibition at the Morgan is one of the pieces, these 2 pieces were together, the portrait of the children. So there is a portrait of the 3 Dickinson children that is held by the Houghton Library at Harvard, and their hair is kind of red in that. And then this lock of hair was exhibited at the Morgan Library, and you could actually see, like, oh, that painting is accurate. This is the actual lock of hair, and that's the painting from, was that 1840 or so, I think is when that is dated to. The other thing I always like to point out is Victorian hair art is definitely a thing. Often in the reading room, when we have a small group of people and we open the little piece of paper and there's the lock of hair, a lot of people are like, oh, that's kind of weird. I was like, Google Victorian hair art if you want weird. That is not weird at all. That is very standard. It was very standard to have a tasteful locket with a lock of your loved one's hair. And on the right in this image is just one of thousands of images you can find of really ambitious artworks made out of often locks of hair from multiple generations within the same family. So this is very much Dickinson participating in, this is the standard Victorian, 19th century American memorializing culture. I can send you a lock of my hair and that will be a little piece of me that you can keep with you. And I believe that fades somewhat. Oh, whoops, sorry. Backing up. I forgot my transitions. So lock of hair, and that the lock of hair is not available in Amherst College digital collection, so I wanted to make sure that we showed it. But now I'm jumping back to looking at these connections between Dickinson and the college. So in addition to her father, Edward Dickinson, serving as treasurer of Amherst College for much of his life, her brother Austin attended Amherst College. And one of the things that we have, because we are the archives of the college, we have things that flesh out Dickinson's world that no other collection anywhere in the state of Massachusetts can match. Not that I have a particular institution in mind. So what we have on the left here, this is a student magazine. So this is a magazine called The Indicator, a periodical, literary periodical conducted by students of Amherst College. The issue for February 1850, I'll just spoiler alert, this is where Emily Dickinson's first published appearance is in an Amherst College student magazine from February 1850. And it's really striking to me that the contents of this particular issue of this particular magazine are so much, so we have an essay on Madame de Stael, we have an essay on Shirley by one of the Bronte sisters, we have an essay on Shakespeare's women. It's a very, I'm not gonna, can we say feminist? It's their feminist issue. And by way of contrast, I wanted to show the image beneath that is, this is what you took senior year at Amherst College. Note the complete absence of any electives. This is what everyone took at Amherst College. You weren't reading Shakespeare, you were not reading the Brontes, you were not reading Emerson or Thoreau. You were reading Whewell's Polity with discussions by the class. You were reading Campbell's Philosophy of Rhetoric. The place our students might have encountered Shakespeare would have been in a course on oratory. And then they probably only would have looked at Julius Caesar. Amherst College has loved Shakespeare's Julius Caesar forever. But just to give you a sense that this is February 1850, this is long before student activities funds. So the students of Amherst College running a magazine was entirely independent of the administration. There were rules. You weren't allowed to have playing cards. We're not going to let you make magazines. We're not going to support that kind of thing. You have to get your Latin and you have to know your geology and worry about Shakespeare some other time. So this is what they did. This was college students exploring beyond the curriculum. This is college students feeling that they had something worth saying and going through the trouble and expense of printing it. And you can see it was printed right there in Amherst, published by the editors, printed at J, S, and C Adams, printers of many, many, many things in Amherst. And this is where Emily Dickinson is published for the first time. So in the editor's corner, which is a bit of a salmagundi, a bit of a grab bag at the end of each issue, they introduce, they mention St. Valentine's Day. And then they reproduce under attention, Valentine Eve, magnum bonum, harum scarum, zuns et war alarmum, man reformum, life perfectum, mundum changum, all things flarum, sir, I desire an interview. So this piece of writing is kind of hilarious and playful. In gold or in purple or sackcloth, and look not upon the raiment with sword or with pen or with plow. And there's a clue that it's Dickinson down near the bottom of the first page. That's what they call a metaphor in our country. Don't be afraid of it, sir, it won't bite. If it was my dog, Carlo now. And we know Dickinson's dog was named Carlo. So this, I love this as a story about college students because they're the same now as they were in 1850. So how did Emily Dickinson end up in The Indicator? These two. So the guy on the left is George Gould, Amherst College, class of 1850, also 6'10". That is one of my criticisms of the Apple Plus Dickinson program. I love that they have George Gould. He's just not tall enough. On the right is Austin Dickinson, her brother. And this again, because we are the archives of Amherst College, we have the class portraits for all of the members of the class of 1850. And so the way the story goes is Emily Dickinson wrote that Valentine letter to George Gould, and George Gould and his friends were responsible for putting the magazine together. Now, you can go back and read that letter, and I'll show you how to find that in ACDC in just a bit. It's a playful letter. This isn't, George, I love you, and they're trying to make fun of Emily Dickinson by putting it in the magazine. This is, I think, a sign of respect. I think they're like, wow, Austin's sister wrote a hilarious response to George. Let's put that in the magazine. Again, this is speculation. We don't know, but we have the pieces. And there's another piece that we have in addition. And you can, I mean, just Austin's hair is just a marvel. And it is until the end of his life. I mean, that is quite a do he's got. George is looking all right too. This is a really fun piece of the story. So this is a manuscript with candy pulling written at the top. Mr. Gould will be happy to see Miss Dickinson at Miss Montague's this evening at 8 o'clock. And I think that's February 1st. So George Gould invited Emily Dickinson on a date. And we don't know if she went on that date, but we do know that she wrote that piece to him that ends up in the Amherst College Indicator. And we do know that she, kept that invitation for the rest of her life. And based on the handwriting, so the front of the candy pulling invitation on the left, and on the back of it is a poem that Dickinson wrote. I suppose the time will come. And based on the handwriting, this manuscript is from about 1875. And that's one of the ways that, and I'll show some examples of that soon, how we date Dickinson's handwriting date manuscripts based on her handwriting. The fact that it's in pencil means that it's likely after 1866. The style of it means that it's not quite the 1880s yet. So we can it's been narrowed down to about 1875. So again, these aren't just random things that contain text and all we are interested in is the words that Emily Dickinson wrote down. What this tells a story that begins in February 1850, or maybe it began before February 1850. Some kind of relationship between Emily Dickinson and George Gould exists, and this is the evidence of it. But the end of the story, maybe it's not quite the end, but part of the story is also Emily Dickinson 25 years later. What is she doing? Was she looking through old manuscripts and thinking about George Gould? And then she had the idea for that poem on the back of that letter. It's not enough to just have the text of these poems in our Franklin volumes or in whatever volumes you have, encountering them as they originally appeared. So to me, the fact that this poem about memory in the past is on the back of an invitation from a boy who liked her. To me, that tells the story. And speaking of daguerreotypes and boys and girls, this, I feel, I couldn't do a presentation and not share. We always show this in the reading room. This may or may not be Emily Dickinson and her friend Kate Scott Turner. I'm not going to say one way or the other, but I think it's fascinating that people think it's fascinating. So the story here of this image on the left is it still belongs to a private collector, a daguerreotype collector, who acquired it because he collects daguerreotypes. It was acquired from a junk shop in Holyoke, Massachusetts, very near Amherst. And Holyoke is known to be the home of the Irish servants who worked in the Dickinson homestead. So there are very clear connections to Holyoke. Makes sense that something like that would show up in Holyoke. But we really don't know. Kate Scott Turner was a friend of Dickinson's. We have ample evidence of her visiting Amherst multiple times around 1859. There were people still shooting daguerreotypes in Springfield in 1859. But until we find that letter or diary, and I was so hoping that when the homestead did all the renovations and but as they stripped the bedroom back to the very floorboards, it's like, no manuscripts turned up. No manuscripts were hidden away that said, on this date in 1859, Kate and I went and got our picture taken. I think it's just impossible. You can compare the two yourself. You can make whatever arguments you want. But it really, to me, I think it's fascinating that people find it so fascinating, that people find it so contentious. What does an image like that mean? What does it tell us about a poet? Why are we so interested? Is it because we only have the one that people are so desperate to have more? I think these are fascinating things to think about. And I think that, yes, so I am now going to move from presenting this as a slideshow and show you the wonders of ACDC. So, great. And so Amherst College Digital Collections is the repository for all of the digital content that Amherst College generates, or mainly archival content that Amherst College generates. We have been preparing for Amherst Bicentennial, which is happening right now. Pretty much between now and 2025, every year will mark the 200th anniversary of a significant event at Amherst College. So the cornerstone of our first building was laid in August 1820. We finally get the charter from the state in 1825. So we've been putting more and more material up online, and our Dickinson collection has been up for quite a while. And one of the things that you can do with ACDC that you can't do if we were in the reading room is simply scroll through thumbnail after thumbnail of Dickinson's manuscripts. And you don't have to scroll very far before you start seeing strange things, like a very narrow and wide piece of paper, a triangle from an envelope that's kind of scribbled out. I love the one, Vinny, out for 10 minutes, wait. So one of the things that I love about this is it's a reminder that every scrap was saved. It really appears, people go back and forth on, Mabel, Loomis Todd and her interventions in Dickinson's texts. We got to give Lavinia credit. We've got to give Mabel Loomis Todd a lot of credit. They saved it. They saved things that didn't even look like poems. They saved weird, long, the lassitudes of contemplation. And so in ACDC, if you click on an item from the thumbnails, you get a different view of it. If you click on that again, we are now able to zoom in like you wouldn't even believe. We can see the fibers in the paper. You can get really close in there. That is the maximum zoom. You can download, you can print these out. These are in the public domain. You can put them on t-shirts. You can do what you will with them. That's why we make them available. If you want to download, it's this little button right here will download a nice JPEG image of that manuscript. And so what I'm going to do now is just jump around and show a few examples of things. And I'll also be, as I'm doing this, demonstrating how to search. So if you have Emily Dickinson collection selected from that menu and you type in 793, you will get the letter I'm looking for, which is Amherst College manuscript number 793. And you will also get, we have many of Mabel Loomis Todd's transcriptions of Dickinson's poems. So in instances where the Dickinson's manuscript might be at Harvard, we might still have a copy that Mabel Loomis Todd transcribed. And I'll talk a bit about that towards the end. But the letter I was looking for is this one. This is from, and this we're looking at the handwriting now. So this is 1849. This is Emily Dickinson's handwriting in 1849. It's a note addressed to Mr. Bowden, who was one of her father's law partners, business partners. And Mr. Bowden used to lend Dickinson books. It was a way that she could get her hands on books that father might not have wanted in the house. And so he loaned her Jane Eyre. And this is the note that she wrote in response to when she was finished with it and was giving it back. And we believe these are notes from Mr. Bowden himself. On returning Jane Eyre, the leaves mentioned were box leaves, sent to me in a little bouquet. And so she writes, Mr. Bowden, if all these leaves were altars, and on every one a prayer that Currer Bell might be saved, and you were God, would you answer it? So a very Dickinson note. Currer Bell, of course, was believed to be the author of Jane Eyre at the time, of a pseudonym. But yeah, so this is 1849 Dickinson, returning a book, and she goes all oblique on us. So bear that one in mind. When we jump to 681, which is Emily Dickinson writing to her friend Samuel Bowles. Again, look at this handwriting. If you didn't know this letter was written by the same person who wrote that last one, I would never have guessed that. Other things that you can notice on these scans, this is in ink. You can see it's clearly pen. There are some pencil annotations made by numerous editors and scholars over the years. We don't let people write on the Emily Dickinson manuscripts anymore. We didn't really ever allow that. But these are things made by some of the first archivists. We think J. Leda is responsible for the numbers in the upper left-hand corner. But this is also a very typical dramatic Emily Dickinson. Dear friend, Samuel Bowles, family friend, lives in Springfield, visits regularly, is not like on Mars or something. Dear friend, the hearts in Amherst ache tonight, and cannot know how hard. You cannot know how hard. And he was gonna come visit and then told her he's not gonna come visit. And so her response is, oh, the hearts in Amherst ache tonight because you're not going to come visit. But we have, I should talk a little bit about, we have a lot of material that came from Samuel Bowles, and we have a lot of material from Austin in our side of the collection. And I'll talk more about how we got the stuff in a little bit. Another example, just to show you how radically Dickinson's handwriting changes. This is one from much later in life. I believe this is from the 1880s, if not 1886. And you can see here, this is in pencil. And the words are weirdly spaced out and the letters are weirdly spaced out. I have a theory about it. When Dickinson had her eye surgeries, when she went to Boston for treatment for her eyes in 1865, 66, there were schools for the blind in Boston, and they were teaching, there was the Perkins School for the Blind, teaching a style of handwriting for the blind. This is before Braille exists. And you can find letters by Helen Keller written out by hand. And I believe that Dickinson may have been training herself to just keep space between her letters and words so that if her eyesight were to continue to fail, she could continue writing. She changes to pencil on the recommendation of her doctor. And there's also very practical reasons for that, at the time you're talking about, not even a fountain pen. Dickinson would have been using a dip pen. So you have this little bottle of ink and you've got to get your, it's potentially much sloppier than a pencil. And a pencil is also something that you could just throw in your pocket and have with you wherever. So if you were, say, in the kitchen, hello, there we go. If you're in the kitchen, perhaps baking a chocolate cake, using some of the Chocolat Meunier Lombard, which again, so this is the chocolate wrapper. This is the famous chocolate wrapper that we have. It indicates that you could get French chocolate in Amherst, Massachusetts in the mid-19th century. That's one of the first little bits of surprise for me. And here's what Dickinson wrote on the back. This is in pencil, and it's not even a poem. Necessitates celerity, were better, nay, and then I've got to check my cheat sheet, to duller by duller things. I think celerity shows up in a finished poem once, but there's no other version of this text that appears in Dickinson. And thank you, Lavinia, for saving it. Thank you, Mabel Loomis Todd, for saving it. Because apart from the text, it tells us that story about, oh, you could get French chocolate in Amherst. Others, that show Dickinson's unique manuscript practice. This is The Way Hope Builds His House. And this one's worth taking a couple minutes with. So first of all, this is one of the envelope poems. So here is an envelope addressed to Mrs. Edward Dickinson and family. So that's what it says on one side of it. And then we can just turn the page, and this is the other side of it. If you look at Franklin in the Variorum edition, the most detailed description of all of Dickinson's poems and all sorts of, that is the, Franklin does not mention the fact that a poem about a house is on a piece of paper that I will suggest looks like a house. You can see the way that Dickinson puts the first line. She breaks the first line up so it fits into the peak of the roof. The way Hope builds his house. Franklin also fails to mention the fact that there are three large dashes separating the attic from the basement, the upper from the lower floor, the upstairs from downstairs. So this is all part of my argument that you need to encounter these texts in their original manuscript forms, because no transcription, even if it says, oh, and the piece of paper this was on is shaped like a house, that's an integral part of this work. This is not a pure textual exercise for Dickinson. This is related to the shape. And again, just as with the chocolate wrapper, we can imagine Dickinson in the kitchen having an idea and needing to jot those down on the first thing that was handy. In this case, we know how important mail is to Dickinson. Letters are her lifeline, right? My letter to the world. So was she maybe pulling apart an envelope and said, hey, that looks like a house? Or did she have an idea for a poem about a house and she's like, oh, and I'll do it on an envelope and make it look like a house? Again, we don't know for sure, but these are the kinds of speculations we can get into as we dig into looking at the actual manuscripts themselves. The last detail on this one, I love that on the very last line, she is not sure whether it's going to be or mortis with the laws or and mortis with the laws. But notice neither one of those options is ruled out or promoted. And clearly she wrote both of those words before she wrote that word. So that's the level of textual scholarship that folks can do with this kind of collection of manuscripts. And we see we're getting close to the 45-minute mark here. So I'm gonna go, I'll do a couple more and then open things up to some questions. And, oh, well, I mean, we absolutely have to, sorry. Oh. You can search by manuscript number, Johnson number, Franklin number. You can also search by first line. What? Did I spell circumstance wrong? Well, there we go. Alone and in a circumstance. So this is another favorite example of Dickinson's manuscript practice being different. And again, you can zoom right in here and you can see, all right, just from how the words are laid out on the page, it looks like she put the 3-cent stamp and the two names clipped out of a magazine on the page first, and then wrote around them. We can see from the style of the handwriting that this is late Dickinson. We can see her practice here of squeezing words in interesting ways. Another thing I'm really just think is fun about ACDC is that the resolution is good enough that you can really see the detail on, this is an embossed little head on a piece of standard stationery. Much of the stationery that Dickinson's working with is perfectly normal. And again, this is worth pointing out that the names, because it's Dickinson, someone has actually figured out where those were clipped from. And those are from the May 1870 issue of Harper's Monthly Magazine, an article about the new editions of George Sand's novels that were being issued by the Roberts Brothers of Boston. And the Roberts Brothers of Boston would eventually publish Dickinson's poems after her lifetime, but not until then. And that I just can't stop without mentioning one last thing about Dickinson and the Roberts brothers and publication. So it's a kind of standard thing that people say about Dickinson is that she did not seek publication. I'm not sure I agree with that. Thomas Niles was an editor at Roberts Brothers in Boston, and Dickinson struck up a correspondence with him. And she sent him lots of poems. She sent him sheafs of poems. And you can look like this is one document. This is everything that was one unit. So this is what Dickinson is. So I would argue or suggest that someone who repeatedly sends packets of poetry to an editor at a publishing company is in fact seeking publication. And the irony, of course, is that Thomas Niles did not seek to publish any of the poems Dickinson sent him. And then after her death in 1886, he ends up having to work on with Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Mabel Loomis Todd. It's like, nope, I guess we're publishing these poems after all. And the last thing that I want to show in ACDC before opening it up to take questions from everyone, recently we added a huge amount of Mabel Loomis Todd's editorial manuscripts. And you can see here the whole history of, so famously, Lavinia first asked Susan Dickinson if she would please edit the manuscripts from my dead sister. Susan does not. Lavinia Dickinson instead, it's like, oh, you're not going to do it? How about I ask, the woman who's been sleeping with your husband for the past, decade or so, maybe she'll do that. And Mabel Loomis Todd took up the challenge. And that story is another story in itself, but I just want to point out a couple highlights. Mabel Loomis Todd tried transcribing Dickinson's manuscripts with an early typewriter. The model she had only had uppercase letters. And so there are a few examples of poems transcribed in that, which hardly seems sufficient if you don't even have lowercase letters. And you can see the different technologies at work here. So here's a transcription that was done with a different typewriter. And then you see many, many transcriptions were done by different hands. And so what we're trying to do with this material is make it as available and accessible as possible. You no longer have to take the curator's word for it. You can actually dig into these things yourselves. And I encourage everyone, we're all, we're living and working remotely in new and different ways. And maybe folks are getting tired of too much screen time, but there are resources out there. And you could this goes on and on. There are 1,987 items in this collection right now. Oh, and one last thing before I open it up. If you want to read Emily Dickinson in the Indicator, the searches here are very, very simple. And so there it is. There's the February Indicator. You could either page through the whole thing, one page at a time, or you can just use the thumbnails back here to skip to the very end. But we also have, you can also read every other issue of the Indicator. We have digitized the Indicator in its entirety. There are thousands of manuscripts around the founding of Amherst College. There's manuscripts in here. You can just dive in and look around. And if that is probably a good place to stop and take some questions, right?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I mean, I've been really fortunate to have many tours with Mike. Mostly they have been in the space itself, in the special collections in the archive, with the objects. And it's really true that, there's something magical about, of course, being able to be there with the object itself, but with ACDC, the ability to zoom in and, as you say, see the texture of the paper, see the embossed stamp it's really just such an incredible tool. And you and your staff have done such amazing things for this collection. And it's such a privilege to be able to be down the street from you and museum and be a partner with you. We have some questions rolling in. I thought I would maybe just go ahead and start it off though, because I wonder if you could tell people just a little bit about what it was like to curate the exhibit for them.
Yeah.
And I know that your wonderful sort of a catalog from that exhibit is also another online resource. So I want to make sure people hear about that.
Yeah. So this was one of those just the pieces fell into place kind of thing. So I was at New York University for 11 years and knew a bunch of the folks around at the big museums and libraries in New York. And so I had friends who worked at the Morgan. And I got a call one day, probably 2015, maybe even 2014, somebody from the Morgan saying, "Hey, Mike, how's it going? Hey, would you ever consider loaning Dickinson manuscripts?" I was like, "To the Morgan? Yeah, of course we would. Why wouldn't we?" And so what started as like, "Oh, wouldn't it be neat? Maybe we'll do that." Then I was invited down to actually meet with some of the curators at the Morgan and talk about what would a Dickinson show look like and how could it be different and why would it be now and all these sorts of questions. And the one thing I don't have a good digital image of with me in remote life is the musket. We have a musket from the Civil War that has Amherst College Gymnasium stamped on it. And I started talking in the first meeting with the Morgan curators. I was like, well, we would have a musket on the wall for one thing. And that got their attention. Because I mean, one of the myths of Dickinson is that the Civil War passed her by. She was in her bedroom, just, writing poetry, and it's like, that's such nonsense. And again, this is an object that tells a story. It opens up a story for us, that we have a musket that was used by Amherst College students who were drilling to join the Union Army and go off to the war. The college instituted those musket drills to keep the students from leaving school and immediately going off to war. And so Dickinson, hearing Amherst College students practicing with muskets, that was part of her soundscape. And what did that mean to her? Well, as long as I hear them practicing with muskets here, that means they're not down south getting killed. Again, so they liked that kind of storytelling. They wanted something that was different. They wanted something that would be, a new version of Dickinson. And we kicked around some ideas, and the wonderful Carolyn Vega, who was at the Morgan at the time, she's now at the Bird Collection at New York Public Library. She was like, "Okay, you're going to work with Mike on this," and we just had a blast. I mean, everyone on this call, I think, would enjoy the chance to like sit down with somebody at a museum of the level of the Morgan. And honestly, the great thing was that Carolyn did all the hard work and I got all the fun stuff. And so Carolyn's the person who reached out to the Houghton Library at Harvard and arranged to have the portrait of the children sent down. I forget what other items they sent. But we also had loans from New York Public Library, has some Dickinson manuscripts. Mount Holyoke College has some Dickinson manuscripts. There were a total of 7 lenders to the exhibition. It was the largest exhibition of Dickinson ever. And one of the most beautiful finishing touches, I thought, was reproducing the wallpaper from Dickinson's bedroom. The homestead was involved too. The museum was involved as well. That like there was one wall when you entered the exhibition, there was the portrait of the children on a wall papered with the wallpaper from the museum. I mean, this really, and then over there is, the lock of hair, and over there's the daguerreotype, and these are things that will never be together again. I mean, that was quite a thing. And one of the theme, which is, if you look at the catalog, which we put up online, the theme is networked recluse. Everyone has this like, oh, Emily Dickinson never left her room. She had a lot of friends. She had friends all over the country, all over the world. She had friends who moved to the Middle East and would send her letters from the Middle East. She had friends, oh, Gertrude Vanderbilt, I'm so sorry to hear that you were gut shot at your apartment in Brooklyn, right? That her friend Gloria Vanderbilt opens the door and a guy who meant to kill her maid shot her in the belly. So Dickinson's world is big and expansive, and her letters with Helen Hunt Jackson that we have some of, that showing her connections to amazing, powerful, fascinating women all over the country. In addition to these her other networks of Samuel Bowles, or her sister-in-law and brother sending her poems to Sam Bowles, who then puts them in the newspaper. So this is a person who had tendrils out in the world, and that's what we were trying to show. And then her network continues after her life with, the Todd family, Mabel Loomis Todd and Millicent Todd Bingham play their role, and then the Bianchis and the stuff that goes to Harvard and all that kind of thing. But it was truly delightful to have that experience. And I have not heard otherwise, so I assume it is still true that this was the most popular exhibition ever held at the Morgan Library. We had 91,000 people come see this exhibition. And it won't happen again. Yeah, that was a hoot.
Where can folks find the Networked Recluse online? Because it's a free downloadable resource.
I had that link up just earlier this morning. I will grab that. It's through the Amherst College Press.
Yes, and we will in our response email to participants from this program, we will link you directly to it. But it is a collection of essays. Mike, contributed to it among other scholars, and it is a terrific resource. We have we have a lot of great questions. Thanks so much, everybody. Some questions about copyright and intellectual property of this particular collection, Mike. Is the entire archive in the public domain? Yeah.
Yes, it is. Unpublished manuscripts are protected for the life of the author plus 70 years. And anything printed in the United States before 1924 is also in the public domain. We published here the manuscripts as they actually look. So, yeah, yes, all of this stuff is in the public domain. These are manuscripts that were not available and are now available. Harvard will try to charge people money if you want to quote them. And it's threading the needle, really, because what is legitimately under copyright is Ralph Franklin's notes. So his original contributions, his original work. But a text of a Dickinson poem that has been edited and modified by Ralph Franklin is separate from us presenting the manuscript as it actually appears with all of her things. So no one did any creative labor to that manuscript to transform it into something that is copyrightable. I get this question on a pretty regular basis. But as far as Amherst College is concerned, these manuscripts are out there for the good of the public. The motto of Amherst College is Terras Irradiant, let them give light to the world. They meant Christianity, we mean digital files of Emily Dickinson letters. And so, you are free to, and there's, I could go, I have a whole hour and a half just on intellectual property rights with Dickinson, but for truly serious, there is no legal restriction on any of that material. Yeah, she's been dead for well over 70 years. So, yeah.
Thank you. We also have a number of people very interested in that manuscript that had the sort of collage element to it.
Oh, yeah.
The George Sand. So they're wondering about further evidence that she was interested in collage in her manuscripts. Are there other examples?
All right, I will share my screen again and show you. So screen share this one. So one of the fun searches that you can do in the Emily Dickinson collection is just the word envelope. It will pull up things that's a normal letter that comes with its envelope. But this is the kind of thing I'm talking about, is where Dickinson takes a piece of an envelope and you see she writes on it in these interesting ways. And this one would have been two pieces pinned together. So you can see, and this is again what is so great about ACDC, you can see the pinholes. You can see the pinholes on page 2, and then you can see the pinholes on this page. So there are multiple examples of Dickinson physically fiddling around with things. Oh yeah, well, let's get the coconut cake. Where's that in here? Yeah, I mean, this just, actually, we just need to do this, I think, just scrolling through these thumbnails. So I wonder if the stamp and the cutouts was a new phase for Dickinson, because she's doing weird stuff to her manuscripts all along. and again, this is just, we can speculate on what she was up to endlessly. But we'll never get the real answer. Like, what is this all about? Yeah, but you can see, like, looking at that is such a completely different experience from looking at what Johnson thinks something is. There's an example in Johnson's letters that my brain exploded when I realized that what Johnson had done was taken several fragments of these little bits and pieces and collected them and made it into a single letter. I was like, no, 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 that is so much, you know, there's been a lot of people putting their lenses between the reader and these manuscripts ever since 1886. And I think our goal is to just strip all of that away, that you don't have to take Johnson's word for it or Franklin's word for it. You can go into these manuscripts and look at them and try and make your own meaning out of it, make your own sense out of it.
We have a number of questions of folks who I think are raring to do just that because they're really interested in the materiality of these manuscripts. So one person is asking, you know, so, okay, she did write in pen and pencil, but when she wrote in pencil, did she erase and or, you know, cross out? Does the collection contain any of her writing instruments?
I wish. We do have one Emerson pencil that might have been hers, but we're not entirely positive. Yeah, I have so many questions. Like, I would love to be a fly on the wall in the weeks after Dickinson's death when Lavinia starts finding these things. That to me is a huge question. Were they all together in one place? Were they tucked in? You know, was Lavinia finding these little triangle pieces of envelopes all over the house? We really don't know. And yeah, we do not have her any of her writing instruments, unfortunately. But there are a lot of crossouts. Actually, there's a good one. So I think she's not erasing. And so you can see, here's a great, and I'm not even going to guess at what this means or try and interpret it in any way. But there are crossouts. There are also crossouts and corrections in the fascicles. I heard a fly. So we do have some of Dickinson's fascicles. These are largely in ink. Harvard has the majority of the fascicles. And I'm looking for a good, you don't have to search too far before you will find, oh yeah, there it is. So I Heard a Fly Buzz is on the top right, but look at this down here on the left. There's that she's constantly using these crosses as sort of little asterisk system. So it's like, oh, I might want this word there instead. So there are folks who will argue that the fascicles constitute a coherent body of work and that if you read them in the right order, a narrative emerges. They are not finished. My theory, my belief, based on looking at these things as closely as we do, this is her filing system. You know, she had to pull her poems together somewhere. Marta Werner is one of my favorite Dickinson scholars, and she loves to point out things like, we don't know how much we don't have, right? So Marta makes the point that it's entirely possible that all these little bits and pieces of envelopes and fragments and weird shaped things also existed for all the poems in the fascicles, and that she simply copied them out and then got rid of them. We don't know. This is speculative. This is all speculative. What we know is what we have. And we really don't know how much we don't have, which is, I find just a fascinating thing to think about. I will also say that we do plan on reshooting a lot of the images of the Dickinson manuscripts. These are now probably 15-year-old scans that were done on equipment that was not quite state of the art. And if you compare any of the older Dickinson manuscripts to some of the newer Todd, notice how all the new Todd stuff looks really nice. Anyway, so, but yeah, you dive into these and, you know, you can search a poem and pull up both the manuscript we have, but also it'll pull up the Todd transcription if we have both. So,
I see. So yeah, so we did have a question about transcription for the Dickinson poems, I believe specifically. And I, you've let us know that part of the goal of your archival practice is to, have an as unmediated an experience these manuscripts as possible. But someone is interested to know if the collection is transcribed so that they are a bit easier to read.
Oh, right. No. Because, we talked about that we had many meetings about how we're going to do this, how we're going to put these up online. And someone, said like, well, why don't we just do transcriptions of them? That'd be so easy. It's like, Ralph Franklin didn't think it was easy. Partly it's simply the labor. It's the labor involved that if we wanted to do full transcriptions of everything we put in ACDC, there would be about 1% of the material would be in there. Our conscious decision was bulk. We would rather have a lot of material that might be hard to read than to have much less material. And we also have folks in our IT department who assure us that eventually the robots will be able to do it for us. That, optical character recognition gets better and better. I still think you're going to hit a wall with Emily Dickinson on that. Some of those, some literary manuscripts are often like really hard to read. Although she has better handwriting than Samuel Beckett, I'll tell you that. So simply the logistical challenges of making that happen. We would love to have a fully transcribed, completely, for accessibility reasons as much as anything, to make these even more widely accessible. It's simply the labor, and we just don't have the bodies. And, some people might feel fine transcribing a letter from the Amherst College president, but as soon as you venture into Dickinson territory, the stakes are higher and people will let you know if you do it wrong.
We have a couple folks who are really interested to know, in your personal opinion, Mike, do you have a favorite era of Dickinson's life to study, explore, think about? And someone else has phrased this slightly differently, but I really like these questions together. In terms of cataloging, she says, which aspects of material history would you consider to be most important? And which aspects can be compromised, if even a little, which is another interesting question.
I thought this was a different thing that I was pulling up. I'm fascinated by the 1840s. I'm fascinated by the period when she was a student at Mount Holyoke, when her brother was a student at Amherst College, when she appears to be at her most social and outgoing, right? That she gets invited to candy pulls and she shows up in the student magazine, and they don't have this image of Dickinson as some weird spinster off in her room by herself. It's super problematic and nuts, but the Dickinson series on Apple Plus, I love that it portrays her as a human being like that. She had friends, she was social. And that partly, I think, I find so interesting because I spend so much time in Amherst College history that, if we look at the stuff that students were writing, that's the one I wanted to show. If we look at stuff in the Amherst Student and Alumni Publications collection, and if you scroll all the way down on the left in ACDC, there's these date sliders. So this is a few hundred items that Amherst College students were publishing during, the period 1829 to 1866. Her dad's the college treasurer. Her brother's a student there. How much of this stuff did she read? Her dad's the treasurer. He hosts receptions for Amherst College people at his house all the time. She couldn't get out of that. And when her brother took over as treasurer, that was happening just across the way at the Evergreens. There are some great examples in our collection of Amherst College documents that Dickinson has written on. So we have a program for an organ concert that she wrote stuff on. I don't think that's even a poem either. I think that's just some more random jottings. What was the other part? So that's the fascinating stuff for me is the school years, that era.
Yeah, and I think the other person was wondering about sort of what are the, for people who are studying Dickinson, what is the most important sort of material
Right.
collection.
Yeah. Um, I mean, it's my one point really. You can see at a glance when she is conforming to the expectations of the format. So sometimes a letter just looks like a letter. And sometimes she is deviating wildly from expectations and norms. And when you think of something like Alone and in a Circumstance, where Dickinson is putting a stamp in the middle, or she's got all these triangles and all these things happening, print technology of her life could not reproduce that. So, I mean, that also counters my own argument that no, she did seek publication, but she also obviously was doing something else. And so taking it as a whole, but I would say there's also thinking of in terms of those networks, right? And some of those are the obvious ones. She writes letters to Helen Hunt Jackson, but the other slightly more remote networks of, oh, this Amherst student moved to New York and started this newspaper, and that explains why this Dickinson poem ended up in the Brooklyn Eagle. And those networks including people who are bringing books and bringing chocolate and bringing coconuts to Amherst, that she's linked out. I think there's a massive digital humanities project around that where we trace on a map every single known associate of Dickinson, but that's for
wow.
later. That's for later. I'm not doing that. That would be great if somebody watching right now wants to start putting all of these things on a map.
Yes, we'll have that program for Poetry Festival 2025.
Yeah, that sounds good.
2030 maybe.
Yeah.
Let's see, so many good questions. One person was specifically interested, you had shown us the indicator. How would that have been, what kind of press would they have used to print that in the 1850s?
Oh, it was probably just a cast iron, a hoe press or an eagle press. It would have been one piece of type at a time laid out on a press. And Adams, Adams is pretty much the only printer in town, the only printer in Amherst for a long time. And that I find really interesting as well, that they were pretty much, they would have had to print the college catalogs, they would print posters for the college. We have a lot of beautiful 19th century wood type posters, but that would be a hand press. It would be typeset entirely by hand, pretty low tech, but still I'm curious about the money. I'm curious about who paid for these student publications. It must have been the students. The college was not doing it, that's for sure. But actually, and that's the angle on the school days that I really do find so fascinating, is you can read in ACDC, you look up the student handbook for 1850, and it will tell you, you cannot have a deck of cards, you cannot do this, you cannot do that. And then what they do is make a magazine with articles about like transcendentalists and lady novelists. So what's up with these kids? I find them so interesting and so near and yet also so foreign at the same time.
Yeah. One person was very curious about another aspect of the manuscript. So would there have been a distinction in Dickinson's time between cursive writing and non-cursive writing? And this is a great question, and I think this stems from your discussion of the way that writing changes over time.
Yeah. This is the history that needs to be done. Honestly, somebody needs to write the penmanship and stationery history of Emily Dickinson, right?
Yeah.
And I know people are looking at the stationery, and those little embossed heads that's brand identification, right? So that's like, the Egyptian head, fool's cap. Her dad's a lawyer, her brother's a lawyer, so she's always got access to paper. But I think exactly that, like, okay, so what would her pencils have looked like? What kind of pens? And we might be able to figure this out if we can get into, the records of a general store in Amherst at the time. What sort of pens were available? What sort of, how did it work? You can see when the typewriter shows up, that's a pretty obvious, like, wow, we need to know the history of these different typewriters. Were editorial decisions made in those transcriptions based on the ability of the typewriter to actually reproduce the characters on the page? All of it. Yeah. I mean, knowing what technology Dickinson had available, and then knowing what technology her transcribers had available. And similarly, we have way different technology than Ralph Franklin had access to, or that Johnson had access to. I mean, never in any of the discussions about Dickinson manuscripts between Harvard and Amherst back in the 50s and 60s, no one ever imagined we would be able to beam them into people's homes or onto their portable, the supercomputer everyone will eventually carry in their pocket. So the technology is, yeah. Somebody should write a stationery and penmanship. And look at it, like the thing too, that's an answerable question in that you can find out what handwriting manuals were being published during Dickinson's lifetime. And I bet you there's a bazillion of them. Because remember too, this is an age of people inventing new writing systems. And yeah, so that's a great, that would be a place to dig. And I don't know that anyone has done that yet. So
yeah. One person wants to know, and we just have probably time for another, let's see, another maybe 2 questions, but this person is asking if there's evidence on the poems, in the poems on fragments of paper, that those pieces of paper were deliberately torn or cut to serve as the accompaniment to the poem.
That's the $1 million question, right? Yeah, like Wayhope builds his house. Did she open it and say, wow, that looks like a house, and now I got a poem? Or did she say, oh, I got an idea for a poem about a house? And then that is, I think that is unanswerable. I think that's unknowable. You could maybe do things, and I mean, it's lockdown time. People have time on their hands. Print out some of those funky manuscripts and see if they piece together. Make yourself a Dickinson manuscript jigsaw puzzle. But that's what we want people to do. That's why it's out there. It really is for me. I'm passionate about, you don't have to take somebody else's word for it. Now you can read someone talking about Dickinson's manuscripts and say, I'm gonna check that out myself, and then pull it up on the screen.
Yeah.
So, although really, I mean, the screen is great, but there is still, the thing that bugs me is you don't get that immediate sense of size. If you can zoom in and out all you want. I read about this a little bit in the Network Recluse catalog. If everything is made to fit your screen, you kind of lose sight that this is this big and this is that big. So
it's true. Yeah, that's hard to allow for in the digital setting. But that's why we have to combine our on-site experiences with our virtual resources.
yes.
I think I'm going to take us to a close with one last question. And this person, let me just find it. Sorry, here we go. Julie has a great question. One focus of her research is on contemporary poets and artists who respond to and incorporate Dickinson's manuscripts into their own work. So Jennifer Irvin, Susan Hale, Janet Malcolm, for example. And would it be possible to talk about those sorts of belated collaborators? Do they have any future in this collection, perhaps, or impact your work?
Oh yeah, no, we do try to keep up. There is absolutely no way we could collect all Dickinson's scholarship because there's just too much of it. But we do collect. We have Jen Bourbon's. Oh crap, I'm blanking on the name of that one. Sorry. We've got Jen Bourbon stuff. We've got Marta Werner and Jen Bourbon did the Gorgeous Nothings piece, and so we acquire those. Yeah, we want to show Dickinson in the world today. It's frustrating. The Amherst College Library will have some of the Dickinson films, but no, you can't collect something that's a streaming TV series on Apple. I doubt they'll ever put it out on DVD, right? Why would they do that? It's a streaming service. So that's the thing I worry about, is that kind of media. But yeah, we recently bought a piece called Autocannon. And I'm gonna blank on the artist's name, but it is it prints out Dickinson. It makes up, it has her entire body of words, and then it randomly generates Dickinson, a strip of paper with just words from her poems on it. It is a beautiful, beautiful thing. But yeah, we collect those, like how Dickinson shows up in the world today. We have stuff, we have dolls in the collection. We have all sorts of little tchotchkes, which just tend to find our way to us. People just send them to us. So we're not out there actively making sure we get one of every bookmark from the Dickinson Festival. It's just, yeah, send us some stuff. But yeah, and we want more, we want to see more of that. And that's, again, why we're pushing this stuff out there, is so that people can make whatever they want to make with it. Yeah.
We're so grateful for your work, Mike. And a number of folks had questions that were sort of biographical. And for you, since we didn't get to answer them, I would encourage you to head over to emilydickinsonmuseum.org, because we have an entire section of our website that is just short essays about Dickinson's life, about her friends, her family, her education, her religious upbringing, her love of nature, her as a cook, or as a baker, gardener. We've got it all there. And of course, you're all going to leave this session and go right over to acdc.amherst.edu to play with this fabulous archive that Mike has just toured us through. Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you to all of you who contributed questions to this today. All of you who tuned in. Again, we really hope that you have also signed up for more programs as part of Tell It Slant Poetry Festival. This is just day one. So we've got lots coming up, more of the marathon every day. You can listen to people reading Dickinson's poems from around the world. We have fabulous workshops and evening readings featuring contemporary poets. Remember that you can connect with other festival goers on our Facebook event or through social media. And finally, just a reminder that the festival is free, but your support is what makes it all possible. So no contribution is too small. To learn more about the rest of our events or to make a donation, you can go to emilydickinsonmuseum.org. Mike, you've been just wonderful.
I'm always, just how long do you want me to talk about Emily Dickinson? Fine, I will fill that space and then some. So thank you.
Next week.
Yes, indeed. All right, but yeah, anytime.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.